Well, my name is Lawrence with a W, Cole, C-O-L-E. I was born in Brattleboro, Vermont on 24 November 1933. And at that time, my father was driving a bread truck in what is called the Winhall Valley. It was the main highway between Brattleboro and Manchester, Vermont. And my mother was working in a furniture store in Brattleboro. My dad had to quit high school as a junior and in order to help support the family. But despite the fact that he hadn't finished high school, he was kind of an entrepreneurial and resourceful guy. He saw a vacant storefront in a little town about 12 miles south of south of Manchester, in Bonneville, Vermont. The road at that point was not paved. Bonneville was famous for the Bonneville Fair. And so he moved us up there in about 1938 and opened, and this was still during the Depression, of course, and I was born at the kind of the depths of the Depression. I can't imagine what my parents were thinking, but anyway. And so he had a country general store in this little town, and he was quite innovative. He had a walk-in meat cooler so that he could have fresh meat. And we used to drive over the hills to Troy, New York, to the farmer's market to get fresh produce. And we looked like a bunch of Okies going over with stuff, coming back with crates of vegetables strapped to the car. It was some kind of a Hudson or a Packard, a big boxy thing with a box on the back. Anyway, we filled it up. And then he had somebody customize a Packard it was not a pickup truck, but it was a panel truck. Mm-hmm. So it was an enclosed truck. He had somebody build an insulated box so that he could use it like refrigeration. Mm. And so he delivered meat and produce and dairy products to logging camps and stuff out in the boonies. And in fact, one of the places that he used to deliver groceries to was a logging camp on Stratton Mountain.
Very entrepreneurial.
Because the logging camps, these people were cutting pulp to be used to make paper. Yeah. And the people literally lived in tar paper shacks. And when they finished cutting the forest, they put the shacks on flatbed trucks and moved to the next location. And so I went out with him once or twice, and the dining hall was just several of these things strung together. So he had, but this was before Stratton Mountain was developed as a ski resort. Uh-huh. So anyway, but then the war came along. I went to a one-room school.
So you were working with your father? Not officially, but as a...
No, I had chores.
Okay.
I was, when we moved there, I was 5 years old. So I went to the first 3 grades of school in a one-room schoolhouse. One-room schoolhouse.
Wow, tell me about it. How many students were there?
Well, there might have been 10 or a dozen, so there weren't students in every grade every year. It was all 8 grades. And then the town sent to Townsend, Vermont, where there was a public high school that had started out as a private school years ago, an academy in the early history. So you went to high school down in Townsend. But this was a one-room school with a pot-bellied stove up in front. There was the toilet was an outhouse, except it was an inside outhouse. My aunt Susie was the school teacher. She had been to normal school for 2 years. So when the war came along, and that meant rationing, and people had points, and there were price controls, Dad didn't want to be in the business. He went to work for another grocery store for a while, but then he enlisted in the Army. He'd never been drafted. He was in his mid-30s. So he was in the service, and when he went in the Army, the folks sold the house that we were living in, and my mother moved to Keene, New Hampshire, where she had a sister. And she got a job in a bank, and I went to public schools in Keene, including through into my junior year in high school. Then I transferred to a prep school called Vermont Academy in Saxons River, Vermont, for 3 semesters, graduated from there, 1951. So I went to college for a year in Keene, New Hampshire. It was a state teachers college. My dad was not willing to help me go to college unless I wanted to go to business school, which I didn't want to do. So,
what did you want to study?
I wanted to study language, and I had been admitted to Lehigh and Lafayette, but couldn't afford it. Anyway, so I majored in math and social studies, but I continued to take Latin. And I didn't do very well. I salvaged about a semester's credit out of a year's work, and I was going to get drafted, so I enlisted just ahead of the draft. I got sent to Indiantown Gap Military Reservation.
When was that?
That was in July of 1952.
You enlisted.
So I went to Indiantown Gap Military Reservation for 13 weeks of infantry basic. And after basic training, if we scored high enough, we had to apply for OCS. And so
OCS?
Officer Candidate School.
Okay.
Okay. And so I was awaiting a decision about whether I was admitted to Officer Candidate School for Infantry at Fort Benning, Georgia. Mm-hmm. And so what they did was, while we were awaiting a decision and orders, we went to leadership school, and they trained us to be cadre, and then we went back down to the training companies to help with the training. Orders for Korea. I shipped out with a bunch of guys that I had been through basic and leadership school with. We went to Fort Lewis, Washington, and we shipped out at Tacoma. A couple of weeks, went to Yokohama. I went to Camp Drake. Were issued weapons, supposed to zero our M1s, and then a boat to Busan, then by train up to Yeongdeungpo.
Have you heard about Korea before, when you were enlisted and also when you were about to leave for Japan? Have you know anything about Korea?
Well, I mean, I knew the war was going on, and I knew a classmate had been drafted. I wasn't reading the papers closely.
Did you know where it was located?
Oh, sure.
Did
Yeah.
you learn about Korean history?
No, I knew nothing about Korea.
Anything about Asia that you learned during the high school?
Well, I paid a lot of attention to World War II in Japan and China. We all heard a lot about Chiang Kai-shek and Mrs. Chiang Kai-shek. They were part of the Big Five. Is that right, Stan?
Yeah.
The Big Five, I paid attention to the island campaign in the Pacific, and MacArthur returning to the Philippines, and then a little bit about the occupation.
But not about.
No, I don't. I'm not aware. I wasn't. I don't think I was aware that we had occupied the South Korea and split it with Russia and taken over from the Japanese. And that's
right.
No, I knew. I could have found it on the globe, but that was about all I knew about it.
So when you arrived in Japan, where did you arrive?
Yokohama.
Yokohama.
Right.
What was your first impression about Japan?
Mount Fujiyama.
Went up there?
No, just you could see it coming into the bay, into the harbor. And then we quickly got on a train. They served us a meal on trays. They put the pears on top of the mashed potato. Anyway, we ended up at Camp Drake, and my first impression was that the first cav had painted everything that didn't move with a first cav patch on it, which you probably have heard from somebody else. And, well, as I say, we were there for a few days. We were to draw personal equipment and our rifles and go to the range and zero them. And there were some classes, but it was just a review of some basic stuff. We quickly shipped over to Korea.
When?
Oh, that was in mid-March of 1953. So I arrived in Korea just about Easter time. And we got on a train in Busan. It was a Korean train. And we, as I say, we went to a place called Yeongdong-po, which was the 45th Infantry Division replacement depot, because at that time my regimental combat team was attached to the 45th Division in the Punch Bowl. So we were in the replacement depot for a while, and then got transported to where the regimental combat team was. As I say, they were just coming out of the Punch Bowl. And then we just started. The first 16 weeks I was in Korea, we moved east-west 14 times and were transferred to either the 3rd Division or the 2nd Division or the 45th or 8th Army or 9th Corps.
Describe me the situation at the time that you arrived in the Punch Bowl. Was there a severe battle daily, or what's happening?
Well, the war had been stabilized along the front for about 2 years. The truce talks had been going off and on since the spring of 1951.
Yes.
And so the front had stabilized, but there was still...
Tug of war, right?
There was, yes, there were... the other side was trying to see how high a price we were willing to pay to hold on to a piece of terrain here and there.
Right.
And we were determined to make them pay a high price to change the line. It had been decided that by then that the UN forces would not make any general offensives forward anymore. So there was patrolling going on. We went out at night on patrols. You went out at night on listening posts and outposts. We were being probed. There were artillery duels. You would read in the Stars and Stripes the next day about 15 or 20,000 rounds had fallen on one hill in one night. So we kept being moved into either blocking positions or up on the front somewhere, filling a hole wherever it needed to be plugged. And that's what we did. We were in the Kumwa Valley with the 3rd Division, and then we were a little further west with the 7th Division, and we ended up the last couple of weeks of the war in July of '53. We were on the line. We were at the front in the Christmas Hill section, adjacent to the 45th Division. And there's a guy on the Cape by the name of Dana Eldridge who's written a book about his experiences in Korea compared with his great-grandfather in the American Civil War. And from the description, I think we relieved his regiment of the 45th Division after it got badly beaten up. It was very rugged terrain. We hiked for 2 days to get into this ridgeline. As I say, I was at the front when the ceasefire came.
Must be very dangerous all the time.
Well, there was a lot of, we were vulnerable to artillery and mortar fire a lot of the time. And you went out on patrols, you were at risk of, in fact, you were at risk of being shot by your own people. Two Katusas were sent down in front of our positions when we were on the Christmas Hill sector to try and identify trees that were large enough to be cut by these work parties of Koreans.
Yeah.
Okay. We went down there to identify trees, and all of a sudden we found ourselves in a minefield. Tripwires all around us about this high, and we'd gotten in there somehow without tripping any of them. We had to get out.
Did you get out?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, but it was the bouncing Bettys. It was our own minefield. But nobody told us. It was on our forward slope.
Oh, I see.
And nobody told us. You know, they were not. When we relieved the company and the people in front of us, they may or may not have known that they were down there, but they gave us no maps showing they were there.
Still most heavily mined area in
Yeah.
the world.
Yeah.
You know?
Yes.
So
Right.
now it's a safe haven for animals.
Yes.
And you know.
And maybe some trees.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
So, were you ever wounded?
No.
Not at all?
No.
Oh.
No. No. Had a couple of close calls, but again from incoming artillery.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Yeah. One night we were moving in. They must have seen us, and we were in pup tents, a little ways behind the lines, and the artillery came in, and so we got into slit trenches. But
when you move from east to west and the other way around,
Yeah.
where did you sleep?
well, it would either have been in pup tents or just in our sleeping bags with ponchos over us to keep dry. If we were going into into reserve position, then it would have been in the squad tents, the 16. But you weren't in those tents unless you were quite a ways behind the line. Although we had, one time when we were in those tents, one of those tents was being used by the officers and by the CP, and a shell came in, and it got the switchboard guy and 2 or 3 officers.
What was the most difficult time or memory during your service? Still that haunts you? Maybe in nightmare, as a nightmare. Do you have something like that?
No, I haven't had any nightmares, and I haven't had anything haunting me. The worst part of, well, there were 2 aspects of Korea. I mean, the artillery just scared was scary. But the other impression was the cold. I still get, my fingers get cold very easy. And we had Mickey Mouse boots,
Yep.
But they sweat.
Yep.
And if you didn't keep moving, it was worse because they got wet. But for a while, we only had galoshes or overshoes. And then we didn't have really good gloves. It was a while before we got the trigger finger mittens. We had the regular leather gloves with inserts, and they were just not adequate for the cold.
Have you written back to your family letters?
Yes. I wrote letters to my mother. She saved them. I have them. They're in that folder, but I have not read them for ever since I found them.
What was your favorite items in sea ration?
Beans and franks.
That's all others saying.
Yeah. They were reliable, and they weren't laced with preservatives. The hot dogs were cooked in the sauce the beans were cooked in.
So when did you leave Korea?
I left in May of 1954. I had the points to come home sooner, but if you got back to the States and had less than 90 days on an enlistment, you got out.
Oh.
So I extended over there for 60 days and came back and got out.
So you had armistice signed in July 27th in 1953. You were
Right.
there.
No, I was there on the line.
Exactly.
Right, right.
Where was it? Do you remember?
Christmas Hill.
Christmas Hill.
Yeah.
Tell me about it. The day that you heard that there will be ceasefire.
Well, I've forgotten just what time of day we found out that the ceasefire was going to take effect at 10 o'clock at night. Okay? We found out during the day, and we were just told to keep out of sight. We're not going to do anything provocative. My recollection is the forward observer who was up on the ridge line wasn't calling in fire on the other side during the daytime. We didn't take in nothing incoming. But then, after it got dark, both sides used up artillery so that and water so they wouldn't have to lug it out of the DMZ afterwards. And there was, but it stopped a little after 9 o'clock, and that was it. But the following, the next day, we went up on the ridge line and looked across, and that night we built bonfires and celebrated and as best you could. I mean, didn't have much to celebrate with.
What did you feel about this armistice, ceasefire? Finally, you don't have to worry about,
Oh, we were delighted. We knew probably meant we were going to live. It turns out the last soldier killed was to our right in K Company of our regiment. I was in Fox Company. And there was, K Company was a couple of companies down to the right. He was in that artillery exchange. This young sergeant from Kansas was killed. He was the last soldier killed. So, we figured we had it made. We were home free. But it turns out, in carrying stuff out, there were accidents. There were casualties from, it was very rugged terrain and people lost their footing and they were carrying cases of grenades.
This year is the 60th anniversary of armistice.
Yes.
At the same time, it's the 60th anniversary of U.S.-Korea alliance. The war lasted 60 years, even after we signed the ceasefire.
Yes.
What do you think about that?
I don't think there are any reasonable diplomatic options to bring North Korea to the bargaining table over a peace treaty. I don't think it's acceptable for them to have further developed nuclear weapons. I don't think the U.S. or the UN will accept that. And I don't think the North Koreans will give up. Well, I think in the case of India, at least it's democratic. Pakistan has elections.
But they are the source of proliferation. North Korea got it from Pakistan.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think.
I'm just asking.
Yeah. Well, I think the difference is that what you have in North Korea is a dictatorial dynasty. I think it's important that the U.S. continue to play a role to preserve South Korea's independence. I'm not sure. I mean, there may be a way. I think it might be worth trying to bargain the removal of American troops for a North Korea acceptance of an inspected, verifiable nuclear non-proliferation. I don't think, under those circumstances, I think we don't need to leave troops there as a tripwire, okay? It's the same idea as troops in Germany were.
Right.
Chinese expansion has not gone beyond Tibet and Nepal.
Right.
Okay? And the Vietnamese are very sensitive to any idea of Chinese expansion.
Yep.
So I don't know what China's intentions are. My concern is both sides will make mistakes like we in Japan did in the 30s.
What did you do in the States?
Well, I came back and I got discharged and I went back to my hometown and I worked with some college friends and I decided, and I had a reserve obligation, so I got back in the reserves. I went to summer camp with my reserve unit. I decided I wasn't ready to go back to college, so I got activated for 2 years, 2 more years of active duty, and it was terrible. I was stationed at Fort Devens in the infantry, and stateside garrison duty is just terrible. So I got out a little bit early and went back to college in September of 1956.
What college?
Keene State. It was Keene Teachers College at the time. It was a single-purpose institution. Graduated in 1959, and I taught public high school in a little town in New Hampshire for 1 year, and then I went to Connecticut for 2 years and taught public high school math. And then I went to grad school at Purdue for 4 years.
What did you study?
Economics.
Well, did you finish PhD there, right?
Well, not right away. I left with my thesis unfinished and went to UNH on the faculty, and I went back in the summer of 1969 and holed up in a graduate dorm and finished my thesis.
What was your thesis topic?
A model of the U.S. economy from 1929 to 1959.
1929 to 59, so including depression
Yeah.
and recovery,
Yeah.
and then
And World War
rise.
II, right.
What is it? Briefly explain about it. What do you mean
Well,
by
it was
model?
it's a model in the sense of it's a small system of equations
Yeah.
that represented economic relationships like consumer spending and employment, government spending, business investment, interest rates.
Oh, so you put those variables together and set it up as a model to explain.
Try to explain the behavior of the economy, and then you use it to try and project. What you do is you have data from, in this case, 30 years, but there was more data. So after you built the model that fits 30 years, then you try to say, now, given what would the model predict is going to happen in the next 5 years for which you have data? And how close is it to how close are the model's prediction to the actuals? Okay, and then I went to the University of New Hampshire on the faculty in the business school in the fall of 1966.
What do you think is the legacy of Korean War and the Korean War veterans? How do you assess it?
Well, I'm inclined to agree with David Halberstam's assessment in the closing chapter of his book, that regrettably it took 30 to 35 years before Korea became democratic politically. But it's become a significant economy. It's a major player. I've read about, the industrialization and stuff has changed family relationships within Korea and old traditions and that sort of thing. But Korea is free. Students come here, go back, are having some influence. I think President Truman did the right thing. I think there were some mistakes made in the way the war was conducted.
And even before. even before, because U.S. made a decision, and it was, you know, there were no choice, but they withdraw all the troops, and then they declared that the American defensive perimeters
Right.
will be withdrawn.
Yeah, and
from the
that didn't
Peninsula.
start with Dean Acheson.
Right.
That was Joint Chiefs of Staff policy before he became Secretary of State.
Defense Department.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. So we make mistakes, but by and large, I think it was the right thing to do. And yet, you have to say that, well, you know, we say we drew a line in the sand, and we proved that aggression was not going to pay. Mm-hmm. It didn't prevent Vietnam, and they adapted their tactics mm-hmm. to a different kind of war. Yep. And we're still trying to figure out how to deal with insurgencies right. and guerrillas, and don't know mm-hmm. how.
Did you see the website that my foundation put up?
Yes.
The Korean War Veterans Digital Memorial?
Yeah, I've been there.
What do you think?
I have to study it some more. I'm glad that an academic is doing it. Mm-hmm. There have been other efforts made. We tried to start one ourselves of an oral history type. Yeah. I don't, and there have been attempts to establish a Korean War museum that have sort of foundered. Yep. But well, and I'm glad you're doing it before we're all dead. You know, when I went to the Marine Corps Marathon, I toured the memorials on the mall, and you know. And there was a group there. What is it called? It's not Angel Flight, is it? Freedom Flight? The people who are bringing World War II veterans, mm-hmm. flying them in from various parts of the country to see it. Mm-hmm. Well, the whole thing got started decades too late. Understand that our children are in their 50s, mm-hmm. and our grandchildren are in their late 20s or early 30s. Mm-hmm. I have a granddaughter that's in the Marines. Those who have served in Korea since the ceasefire are eligible to join the KWVA. Yeah. We just haven't been able to attract anybody because, after all, most of them are still working for a living. Yeah. And they don't have time for weekday afternoon meetings.
Do you have any comments for young generations for both Korea and the United States about your service?
When I think of Afghanistan and Iraq, what I think of is that I don't think about Korea. I think that we didn't learn the lesson of Vietnam. Mm. I mean, that was a complete and utter waste, and we did it again. And worse than that, it was done by an administration that consisted primarily of Vietnam War draft evaders. I think young people who are either thinking of volunteering or are in a country that are eligible to be drafted, you've got to be careful not to be conned into being sent into a war that's ill-advised, that is unnecessary. Yeah, I mean, you can't trust leaders to do your thinking for you. And you've got to be involved in the process and keep track of what's going on. Otherwise, decisions get made about over which you didn't have any chance to express either an opinion or exercise any control. Mm-hmm.
What is your lifetime project that you want to complete rest of your life? Is there anything like
that? There's a lot of stuff I haven't read yet that I want to read before I go to the other side, because I've invented this new religion that says that the quality of life on the other side depends upon how much learning you take with you. Oh, I want to go to England, and I'd like to go to China. I want to go back on a revisit tour to Korea.
You've never been back to Korea?
No. So I want to go to Australia, and I want to go to New Zealand.
Larry, thank you very much.
You're entirely welcome.
Time.
Glad to do it. I'm glad you're doing it.
Precious time, and thank you for your service and sacrifice. There is no Korea without Korean War veterans.
Yeah. Nice. Yep.
Thank you.
You're welcome, sir.